listening to Thanissara, this movement of identification with the thinking. It's called, in the original teaching, the phrase avijja paccaya sankhara means that not understanding the mind or the heart, the citta, which means mind, heart, this deeper nature of awareness and presence, not knowing, the mind not knowing its deeper nature as primordial awareness and presence, and with this quality of buddhi, knowingness, there is a tendency to mistake what moves through the heart as ourselves. So this movement is called paccaya sankhara, making things, concretizing the world through the identification with thinking and language. And it's not a put down of thinking and language, because language is awesome, it's extraordinary to be able to think and have language, but it's this leaning on language and thinking, hoping that we'll describe ourselves to ourselves, and we'll find a home and a place in that description, some end, some completion, and of course then the languaging and the thinking and the storying shifts into something else. So this, the Buddha said, this tendency generates this experience of what he called dukkha. The dukkha has this sense of unreliability. Things are unreliable because they're changing, including the process of the thinking mind, which is perhaps the most subtle way that we experience ourselves, is through often our thinking, or describe ourselves to ourselves. So what is dukkha has a taste of unsatisfactoriness. It has this taste, sometimes translated in English as suffering, or of the limitation, that we feel this sense of suffering because we experience a limitation that the life can't always give us, or our thoughts can't always give us, or others can't give us, or the world around can't give us what we always want. Or we get what we don't want. Sometimes things happen that we don't want to have happen. We can't control it. And then what we do want to have happen doesn't always happen. Sometimes it does, but when it doesn't, then we experience this dukkha. So the Buddha said that not only is this tendency for the mind constantly trying to find a place that is a home and that has stability in the world of change, and most subtly, as we've been discussing, the world of thinking, that this tendency of creating a sense of unsatisfactoriness for ourselves, but also not only is that a source of this unsatisfactoriness, this sense of unsettledness that we feel, but also, and this feeling of that comes around from not really getting what we want and being with the experiences that we don't want, and then trying to bring about some kind of happiness for ourselves in a world of change. So this is natural that we do this, but if we don't really understand that what we're doing is trying to demand sometimes from life, or from ourselves, or from our body, or from our moods, or from each other, or our family, or community, or country, or the world, that it gives us what it can't, then we generate this constant sense of discontent. And it's this suffering, this kind of suffering, that the Buddha said we can actually overcome, that we can, through wisdom, through understanding, we can really completely overcome this kind of unconscious agitation that's generated through our inability to really accept life as it is, the flow of life, to accept the body as it is, to accept ultimately the limited, and to stop trying to find the unlimited or the immortal in the realm of change, or the realm of the mortal. And this was, I suppose, when I entered my monastic training with through meeting Ajahn Chah in both England and in Thailand, this was perhaps one of the essences of what was what I learnt in the monastery, not necessarily through some great philosophical dissertation, but through actually coming into contact with the limitations that I experienced by living within a discipline and within a lifestyle, and with people that I found difficult. And so Ajahn Chah used to say, sometimes it's the suffering, that ignorance conditions, not understanding reality, not understanding the nature of the mind, hoping that the impermanent will give us stability. This conditions suffering, but suffering conditions wisdom, if we know how to actually work with our difficulties and not just unconsciously suffer. And so Ajahn Chah would always conspire in a way, and that whole way of life would conspire to bring you to a place where you couldn't really move the situation, where you had to really look at what the mind was doing, how it was creating suffering out of sometimes very simple things. Like one day he said to one of his Western disciples who was just sweeping the path of leaves, which is something you do in Thailand, is just spend a lot of time sweeping paths. Very simple activities in a monastery, because a lot of the inquiry is on an internal level. So one isn't creating building empires. One's just, sweeping leaves. And this particular monk was, while he was doing this activity, he was suffering a lot, because he had been a very intelligent and bright and American. And there he was, a nobody sweeping leaves in Thailand, and he was discontent. So Ajahn Chah saw him there suffering, and then came up to him and said, well, is the suffering in the broom? Is it in the leaves? Where is it? What's really the problem here? And he realized that actually it was a very profound moment for him, because he realized that it wasn't in what the moment was doing, it was in his relationship to what the moment was, and his demand that there be something else happening than what is actually happening. And so it's a very simple principle, and so Ajahn Chah used to say, when you can't move forward and backwards, when you can't move to the side, when you can't go up and down, when you can't escape actually the limitations of the impermanent world, when you're really faced with a challenge and you can't just manipulate the situation, then there is the real wisdom can begin to emerge. Then, or it might not emerge. One might actually then default to one's more primary patterning of the mind, which is usually to fight or to freeze or to flee. He says this is how we're, at our most primitive level, almost as human beings, this is how we're conditioned when we meet difficulty. We fight it, or we flee, or we try and, or sometimes we might freeze, but we don't sometimes have another way to actually contemplate conflict and suffering. And so what I understood when I came to that similar point in my own monastic training, when I had gone in, I was very idealistic, hoping that somehow I would just float away on some pink spiritual cloud and never had to deal with this difficult world again. But when actually I realized that my difficulties had increased because I was living in quite a hard lifestyle and with people I hadn't particularly chosen to be with, and I was now not only married to one person, I was married to a whole community, and it was quite not that easy. And then one day a conflict arose, and I could feel these ancient reactions of aggression and anger and upset, and then wanting to leave. The sort of things that come up for all of us at different points in our life. And I realized I couldn't move, and I couldn't control the situation, and I couldn't control what I felt, and I couldn't repress it, and I couldn't really blame anyone. And I had to somehow accept the mind and and suffering, and start to work with it more consciously. And this really inducted me or brought me into this way of what the Buddha called the middle way, or the way of mindfulness, or the way of really not just reacting to our experience, but contemplating the limited for the sake of really understanding the unlimited, for really understanding how the mind would identify and get lost in these pathways and labyrinths of reaction and thought. And that in the moment when I really was able to just profoundly accept and open to the situation and not demand anything be different, in that moment, that's not a strategy for all of life, but in that moment I touched another dimension which I hadn't really awakened to before. And this was this dimension that Thenisaara has been pointing to, and which indeed the Buddha pointed to when he said, if there wasn't the unborn or the uncreated, there would be no freedom from the created and the born. In other words, another way of saying this, if there wasn't peace or nibbana or non-suffering, there would be no freedom from suffering. And usually our freedom from suffering is just to move and to distract ourselves and to just turn on the TV or go somewhere else or flip a switch and our reality can change. But, to realize there is a whole other dimension and a way of freedom when the mind releases from its demands and its identification with the flow of the phenomena of the moment, then it can touch its own nature, this peace, its awareness, its presence. And it was a great revelation for me, and it gave me a whole new way of beginning to explore being in life and understanding how to perhaps practice with whatever would then come to me. In this way of awakening, it's not so much, I think at first we might think it's about, like finding, or this way of peace, we might feel like it's about finding some peaceful place where we don't have to deal with anything, but actually in many ways awakening means we literally wake up, we wake up, as it's said in one of the most profound sutras in the Buddhist text, the Heart Sutra. It says we wake up and we leave dream thinking far behind. We leave these dreams of our thoughts and our stories far behind. We wake up, there's a shift from dreaming through our life to waking, to see more clearly all aspects of ourselves. And to that awakening means that we start to not only see the suffering, but we start to engage all the different dimensions of our life and of our experience. And so as the mind begins to move inward to peace, it also is moving inward to contemplate itself and its patterns and its loves and its hates and its attachments and its moods and its highs and its lows. And all of this, rather than somehow being in the way of awakening, becomes the fuel for our contemplation and for our awakening. In what I wanted to sort of move out from in a way this more personal journey, is to begin to explore how these principles can apply for the larger context that we live in, and in particular the context that we're in globally at the moment, where we could say, the same principle of meeting the limitations of how we can extract from life what we might want personally and realize at some point the futility of that. We've actually arrived at a place more globally where we've reached a certain limitation in terms of the sustainability of the way that we're living. Recently, Thenisaara and I returned to Oxford, where he was at university, to attend a gathering of Rhodes Scholars. And this was after 110 years of the Rhodes Scholarships. and these meetings that happen every so often, and people get together, and there's different lectures and different discussions. And one of the lectures that happened right at the end of the 3 days of gathering was about the environmental situation that we're in and thinking pathways to the future. And one of the speakers, who's also a former Rhodes Scholar, was a man who's actually originally from South Africa called Kumi Naidoo, who was quite involved in the struggle years during the apartheid regime. And he now is the international director of Greenpeace. And he was talking about how if we actually, there was him and a leader from America and someone from New Zealand who were both involved in business and politics, talking about the current situation that we live in globally. And Kumi's Naidoo's point was that if we all wanted to live, now we're now 7 billion moving to 9 billion people on the planet by perhaps 2030, if we all wanted to live at the kind of standard of living that we all aspire to, and naturally aspire to, the comforts that we have and the conveniences that we have, we'd need 8 planets to sustain us. I don't know if that's exactly factually true. I don't know how they would come to that figure, but certainly we would need more than one planet. And as we know, it doesn't take much logic to know we don't have a planet B. This is it. And this is a moment, if we look at where the Buddha, where the Ajahn Chah was pointing personally to us personally to work with our own limitation and stop trying to extract from the limited realm the unlimited, stop trying to get everything that we want from the world around us, hoping it will make us happy, and then the power of when we reach limitation and suffering, that the way that can actually open us into our hearts and into other dimensions that awaken and grow in us not only the recognition of peace, but qualities that we need to work with challenge and suffering. Then on a larger scale, we could say that we've reached a very interesting moment in our global consciousness, or in our global family, or in our global situation, that we have reached a point of really the reality of our limited resources and our inability to really see that clearly is coming home in no uncertain terms to us. We now have the situation where it's said if we have like 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the air, then that's quite comfortable reasonably for us to live, but we're now nearly just recorded 400 parts per million, which is actually very dangerous. It means that the planet, the surface of the planet is warming and capturing more greenhouse gases, and through that process that it's beginning to trigger uncontrollable weather patterns. So we're experiencing an acceleration of droughts and of floods and unstable conditions, which has in its own way unpredictable effects. So that this is one thing that we're experiencing from the climate change that's happening around us. Another great source of that which helps stabilize the weather and stabilize the atmosphere is the great oceans, which are now acidifying, and then also the fish stocks are collapsing, triggering conflicts over resources, which will probably increase as more resources become scarce. We have the situation where 80% of our industrial agricultural lands are used, for growing 30% of cattle and so on, animal for meat and dairy. So it's a very sort of low yield way of using land, and at the same time is also increasing the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. We have also this model of progress, when Thenisaara was talking about how his focus on success, to get somewhere else than where we are, this is in a way part of the model of our contemporary culture. It's this model of getting and progressing, and in some ways this is a very good model. It's not a bad model, but sometimes the way that model is taken and it has become unconsciously feeding a real disconnection from the Dharma, of the reality of the very ground that supports our very life. And so we have a sort of a cultural narrative of progress at all costs, which increases aggression and competition and a dominance of resources as something that is our moral right to take resources as we need them, leading now to a tiny percent of the wealth held by a small percent, and increasingly larger percentage of people having less and less wealth and resources, and so that the richest 300 people now globally have more than 3 billion people, and so on and so on. I mean, these are just some of the stats. I'm sure you're familiar with some of these increasing dynamic that we're living in, which of course increases social instability, as we see in our country we've been working in for 20 years in South Africa, where there's an increase, post-apartheid. In a way, it was a miracle in many ways, but it didn't come about easily. It was a long struggle to work towards more social equity and racial equity and justice. But still, there's a great increase in instability from the discrepancy of wealth and poverty within the culture, and this is one of the most destabilizing facts of any society, to have this kind of discrepancy. And so this ongoing model of progress in a way has now morphed into a corporate kind of machinery that's almost become dehumanized, and it just sees the world and the resources of the world as a means for profit, regardless of any social or ethical responsibility, regardless for any care or sense for sustainability, or for any kind of building of community or nation. They're not affiliated sometimes with community or the nation that operating within. And so in a way this cycle increases the inequality and social discord. So these are contemporary problems that are affecting all of us. It's not just we can live in a bubble and say, well, that's just over there. This is the nature of the new world we're in now, that the global trends are something that sort of come into all of our lives. And something like Fukushima, for example, our use of nuclear power, which is a big issue. How are we going to power ourselves when the fossil fuels we know are increasing the very likelihood of our inabilities to live sustainably, with great dire consequences, and then the nuclear power. So the most horrendous effects from Fukushima that are still in some ways with some sort of collective denial about, and still seeping out into the Pacific and affecting the oceans and the fish stocks and who knows what else. The full story perhaps we don't really know, and yet these are not only to talk about that, but also the nuclear weaponry. And we could sort of blow ourselves up 1,000,000 times over now. I mean, it's an extraordinary, intense context to be in, and of course we're in a country that we don't need to tell you about intensity because you live it all the time, and difficult dilemmas, irresolvable dilemmas, and how to be with this. So this is this is the mind. This is the mind, the conceptual papancha proliferation is brilliant, that's extraordinary, that has commanded the enormous technological power to serve our desires and our fears and to protect and to dominate and to extract what we want. And now we have the karma, we have the results of that like that moment in the monastery when I realized I couldn't move. It's getting harder to move away from the reality of the limited resources and the limitations that the reality of what the results of that is, of our way of living is. This mind, the Buddha said so many thousands of years ago, he said this mind is burning with lust, with the fires of fear and the fires of hatred. And it's this mind that when it's not really understood and not seen clearly, that when it's projected out into the world, these are some of the results. This mind in Buddhism, this aspect of the mind, manas vijnana, which means a consciousness that goes out and sees everything as an object to ourselves. We see things as out there and other. So when we see everything as other, then it's there to be owned. It's there to have, right down and patent, right down to the last blade of grass. But such a mind, when we're addicted to such a mind, then I think when the more subtle consequences are we experience this loss of connection, of like soul or heart, or loss of belonging to the earth, or loss of sensitivity, or we experience dukkha, suffering. So in the same way as we could say on a personal level that a crisis of suffering, while it's painful, has the potential to awaken us, we have perhaps an increasing crisis globally of at least resources, if not on many other levels. Perhaps there's a potential in that not just to default to our more primitive patterning of fear or flight or freeze, but to see maybe there is a potential that's coming to us now to awaken to another dimension, and to bring that dimension to bear upon our relationship within the world. And this really, in a way, this is the dimension of the heart, of the citta, of the awareness that isn't the heart that separates out, but the heart that knows the ultimate seamlessness of everything. It's said that that in the Heart Sutra again, which is a very early text, that the Avalokiteshvara, who's illuminating the sutra, Avalokiteshvara is a great bodhisattva in Buddhism who represents compassion. It's said that when Avalokiteshvara was practicing the Dharma and had a lot of wish to help the suffering and living beings, that at a certain point the suffering was so great in the world that Avalokiteshvara's head just split apart and shattered into 1,000 different pieces. In the same way that when we suffer, sometimes it's shattering to us. We don't know what to do, we can't move, we can't change the situation. And it shatters us, whether it's sickness, whether it's the death of a loved one, whether it's just the poignancy and the overwhelming conditions of life. And at that point, Avalokiteshvara's guru came down and appeared, Amitabha Buddha, before him and said, well, what's the problem? What are you doing? And Avalokiteshvara said, well, I took this great vow to really have compassion and to help living beings, and it's just too much. The living beings are just caught up in their fear and their violence and their delusion, and I can't do it, and it's just too much. And so it's said then at that point his guru put him back together again, or her. Avalokiteshvara also appears as Kuan Yin, it's a feminine form, and created 11 heads and 1,000 hands and eyes. This incredible form, which is a metaphor for the transformation of what can happen when we really enter the path of suffering and it shatters us. And we may think everything is lost, but in that moment there's a shift that can start to take place, and from those ashes something new can emerge. There is a particular ability to develop more capacity. So this shift to this Heart Sutra, this shift of consciousness, is really a shift of consciousness that this crisis that we're in, any crisis, but particularly this global crisis that we're moving into, invites us, demands really that we undertake a shift of consciousness where we begin not only to see the world as an object to ourselves, but in reality to realize that this world is actually profoundly intimate. There is no out there, even as Thenisaara was quoting from the new physicists, there's no out there that's apart from us ultimately. We're part of a seamless whole, a seamless interconnected world. And in that way, when we touch into that reality of the heart, it starts to shift in the same way as Avalokiteshvara's body was changed and empowered in a different way. It starts to shift our shape or our way of being in the world, and our way of being with everything, every breath, every friend, every foe, every challenge, every blade of grass that appears in the garden. Everything then becomes part of this one body, becomes intimate to us, we become sensitive to, we resonate with, we feel with. And so this movement from the suffering can begin to shift into realized and awakened response. Avalokiteshvara is also known as the one that's fearless, that's in the world from a place of fearlessness and courage, is able to be in the world from a place of compassion and kindness, is able to be in the world from a place of mercy and not keep generating more suffering. To be able to move from the isolated suffering mind to connect with living beings and see our empathy and our interconnection with each other. To be able to move from a lack of ethical regard for life and for other living beings, where we perpetuate harm and division, to one where we can start to really have a more heightened sense of ethic. How do we respond? How are our actions? What do we do? What are the impact of our actions? This is the way of mindfulness. It's more hard work than just acting unconsciously, but it also demands that we take responsibility for not only ourselves, but to realize everything we do. This mind is very powerful. It affects the context that we live in. That instead of a fascination that we have with violence, that we can move to empathy, or instead of just loveless kind of relationships that exploit, there can be a move to cherishing and true intimacy in our relationships. Or instead of just soulless consumerism, just to take away the pain and go out, shopping because there's nothing else to do, and not really connecting what we're doing with where the resource is coming from, we can begin to really know how to find true contentment and, in more simplicity, enjoy one breath. Why not? This is what meditation really opens for us, so that we really feel, we can really feel filled with the beauty of life, rather than feeling that we have to just fill up with more and more stuff to feel ourselves. And so we're not just consumers, here to somehow just eat the planet up. We're not just suffering beings that just can suffer unconsciously. We have this awakened potentiality, this buddhi that has a quality of knowing and wisdom, depth of intuitive wisdom that's connected with the vast intelligence of this universe. And this is our inheritance, that we are conscious, humane, that we can be in this world from a place of love. We can have joy, we can explore creativity, we can find our completion in the service of the whole. And this is something that the Buddha himself realized, that actually anyone that doesn't have something larger to serve lives unhappily. And so after his awakening, when he thought about this, he thought, well, what can I serve? And he realized he can serve the Dharma, he can serve life. We can all do this, and in this way we find our completion and fullness, because then we realize that we're not apart from life, we are life. We are both the timeless and time, the mortal and the transcendent, that all of this is the magic and mystery of the fullness of what we are.